This is our interview with Judy Runnels, and during your time in the legislature, how were you, how did they refer to you? What title was given to women legislators?
Representative Runnels.
From Topeka?
Yes, often they add the district.
Uh-huh.
You know, they usually put your denomination like D56 when they would refer to you in the paper. That's common of just about any legislator, male or female, I think.
Uh-huh. Yeah, I don't believe maybe it was, we don't know for sure, but in the 1920s, I believe there might have been a different
was there?
Name given, and we notice in the listing of them anyway, they're listed differently, and that's one of the reasons we want to ask that question.
Yeah, I mean, are you asking, did they call me Mrs. So-and-so?
Uh-huh.
Well, whenever anybody called me Mrs. So-and-so, I always correct them. I still do. Because I like to be called by my name, Judith C.
Okay.
But that's my own. I have, you know, if not insisted, I certainly have tried very hard. Sometimes it's hard to get people to do it.
Your present address is 404 Woodlawn. What is your California address going to be? Do you know, in case we need to contact you?
Certainly. 365 Forest, number 2D, Palo Alto, 94301.
Okay, now this is not showing red when you talk.
We're not picking me up enough. I'll sit forward. I can.
Let me move this over a little further.
Emo.
There we go. Okay, give us your address
again. You want to play that back and see whether you got me or not?
Yeah, I can tell it's doing that. Just read your address again.
365 Forest, number 2D, Palo Alto, 94301. And that's Judith C. Runnels, no title.
I love it. Okay. When did you serve in the Kansas legislature?
I was elected in 82. And so then I served 83, 4, 5, and 6.
Okay, you were there 4 years.
2 terms, yeah.
You were in the House.
In the House.
What was your district number?
56.
56 at that time. They keep changing these things. What did your district consist of then?
Well, at the time, it just changed. It ran from about 5 blocks east of here. I'm sorry, I can't think of the exact boundary. West to the governor's mansion, including the governor's mansion, actually to the city limits on the west, and up sometimes to 10, sometimes to 12, back around, and one little piece over in North Topeka.
Okay, but it's changed since then.
It's changed. When you interview Kathleen Sebelius, the current representative, she can give you the new. Yes, each district will be a little bit larger in area now because of the shrinking population, and it's moving eastward.
Okay, you were elected to your first term, correct? You weren't appointed. You were elected?
I was elected, yes.
Can you describe your election, your first?
Sure. Election? As a matter of fact, I have tape of the making of that election, if you're interested. I was trying to decide what the heck to do with that. Some Washburn kids were doing research, and they came out and videoed me and interviewed me. I've never looked at it, but I was digging yesterday and I ran across it. What was it like? Well, I'd been a lobbyist for 7 years with the Kansas State Nurses Association, and you know, when you spend enough time around there trying to influence legislation and so forth, you decide that you're at least as smart as half of them. And I had also spent a lot of time encouraging nurses to run for the legislature over the years and to get active in the process and so forth. Anybody does who lobbies for a group, exhorts their group to become more active. And so I just decided, I did work for Governor Carlin then a couple of years after I was in the legislature. And that was interesting, seeing government from the executive standpoint, working in the executive branch for a couple of years, but I still had the itch to run. So I decided to do that. And in 1982, I've been gearing up for a long time. I've been saving a file when I run for the legislature. I probably had it for 7 or 8 years. So it was not an instant decision. It was something really I almost came here knowing I was going to do it.
Hmm.
I was on a planning commission in Mountain View when we lived in California before, and I had been active in the League of Women Voters, and I was in the League of Women Voters here and was president and other offices. So I was not recruited by the party. I decided I was going to run and sought the support of the party, which was, the Democrat Party never has a lot of money. And most people were supportive, and I didn't have a primary opponent my first time.
Was it the district was open then?
It was an open seat because Ruth Wilkin retired.
Okay.
Oh, that's right.
And my opponent in the first race was Dwayne Pomeroy, who had been on the school board and who, knew how to campaign and things.
Mm-hmm.
But anyway, one of the things, I had a lot of expert political advice, of course, and one of the things they advise you to do is to look into your own background and find out where your own natural support groups are. And of course, my natural support group was nurses, because I had been very active in it and was pretty well known by nurses, and they were wonderful. They helped me get everything set up. As far as we set up files on every registered voter in my district and had them according to the precincts and streets and so forth. And then when we knocked on doors, we wrote little comments on the cards. Like if they said they were supportive or going to vote for me, or they absolutely were not, or if anything we remembered, we tried to write it down as soon as we left. My dad helped me campaign, my nurse friends helped me, and usually we'd walk on either side of the street. Sometimes on weekends my husband would help, and he'd do the cross streets, and we'd do, but we did knock on every door. And of course I'd knocked on them a lot of times for Ruth, because I supported her. She just lives down the street. This is 5 representatives from District 56 have lived within 5 blocks of each other. Because there's Austin Northern down there, there's Skoog, and Ruth Wilkin, and I have represented, and now Kathleen. We all live, everybody's lived in Potwin. So Potwin.
So what is there about Potwin?
Well, I don't know. I mean, this is a little diversion. All I can tell you is that the demographically speaking, the Potwin neighborhood, which is a little larger than this 2-block area, but has an average education of 1 year past college. Average education of 1 year past college. Therefore, there's just a lot of people who perhaps have a higher interest than another neighborhood might in what's happening.
That's interesting. Well, you said the nurses encouraged you. Did you have any one person besides the group that encouraged you to run? Can you identify any one person that gave you a lot of encouragement?
Well, I decided to run.
You did.
I decided to run, and then I sought support and got a lot of support from nurses. I got a lot of help from. I spent 1 semester at KU thinking I might get a master's, get an MPA, but I didn't do it. But I did take that 1 semester, but then I had a much greater itch to run for the legislature than I did to get a master's. So.
Why? Because I think so many people would regard running as much scarier than getting a master's.
To me, it was a lot easier. Everybody has their own skills. I have pretty good people skills that are not anything that just natural. It's just natural. I just had a dad that was always in stuff and knew a lot of folks, and my mom too, and Daddy was always active. In fact, I just ran across a thing where he was honored by the Kiwanis Order of Lawrence 20 years ago for being such an active citizen. I kind of grew up in a family that was sort of that way. And to me, it's a lot easier to greet people and ask them to vote for me than it is to write theses.
There may be a point here.
Yeah.
Well, Jack, my husband, has always said that I was academically lazy, and it made me so mad, but I'm afraid he has a point.
Well, besides the nurses, did your family, you mentioned your father, your family
yes.
campaign for you? And
My dad campaigned for me, and he's a rock-hard, long-time, lifelong Republican, and I'm a registered Democrat. And that was I didn't know whether he would or not. I really didn't know whether he would or not. And I had kind of come to terms with myself, well, if he won't, I understand. But he did. He came over and he knocked on doors for me, and he, when he'd get a strong Republican, then he'd tell him he was too, and there were exceptions to the rule. I don't know. Daddy got a lot of votes for me. He got a lot of votes for me. He was pretty slow compared to me going door to door, and sometimes I'd go all the way down a couple of blocks and come back and meet him, and he would have done 5 or 6 houses. But he would have helped them fix their garage door opener, gone in and had this heart-to-heart and found 6 people they both knew, and so he won a lot of votes for me. Also, my mother died during that campaign. She died in September of '82, and we were in the middle of it. And we talked about it, Daddy and I talked about it, but she would have not wanted me to quit. And he didn't want me to quit, so we took off a week and mourned and buried her and went right back to campaigning. And there was a couple of times, and then it was a nice thing that Daddy and I could do together every weekend, and I didn't have to quite worry about him so much being a widow or alone over there in Lawrence, because he had never so much as boiled an egg. So at least on weekends, he ate here, and we campaigned, and he broke down in a house or two and cried about his loss, but that seemed to get me votes too. But mostly, I had some good advice from, I guess I don't know if I should say the name or not, but he was one of my professors at KU, a poli-sci professor. And he had really good advice about door-to-door campaigning. One was that you have to ask for their vote. People hold their vote very dearly. It's a very important thing that they possess, and if you don't ask them for it, they haven't committed it. So you have to ask. You can't say, I hope you'll think of me on election day, or some euphemism, because you really have to look them in the eye and say, I came to ask for your vote. Now, I didn't say that until we visited just a little bit. Just a little bit. But another thing that this professor pointed out to me is that people vote their pocketbook, but they like to rationalize it on a higher plane. And sometimes when you visit with people, you can get a feel for both their pocketbook and how they would like to rationalize it. And sometimes you can help people to verbalize their higher feelings. That sounds very crass and very calculating, but it really isn't. It's a way of listening. Because people really, the main difference in me and my young opponent at that time is that we all really did try to listen to people, and he spent a lot of time telling him about his accomplishments. But people don't really want to hear about your accomplishments. And people really they're basically interested in themselves. And if you can, you just go and you introduce yourself. And of course, I always said I was a nurse, and some of them would show me their scars or tell me about their operation or a sick relative or whatever, and we'd visit like that. And I would leave, and I always ask them to vote for me. And some would commit on the spot, and some would just thank me. But the thing is that if they're uncommitted, which, a certain percentage, 40% maybe or 50%, of my district was not committed, and no one else asks them, they're likely to remember that when they go to the polls, that you ask.
Mm-hmm.
And so I always did ask. Of course, most people vote on name recognition only. So another goal when you're campaigning is to get your name in front of the public enough times, I believe 7 is the minimum, that it rings a bell when they go to the polls. Because a lot of people really, no matter how much we talk about everything we're for and everything we're against and all the things we're going to accomplish and so forth and so on, people don't remember that. And you're lucky if they remember your name. So that's also one of your goals. And that's why you write them a little thank you note, or why you try and, between the knockings on the door and the flyers you put out, you try to get 7 things in front of them with your name, Runnels.
I want to go back and ask you a question. How come you're a Democrat if you have this rock-ribbed Republican father?
Who knows? Who knows? I don't know. When I really got to thinking about it, just like I thought about running for a long time before I did it, I thought a long time about my party. And I used to be a registered Republican. When I first registered to vote, I didn't know any different. It's like going to the same church, you know? I didn't think about it when I was 18. I'm not proud of that fact, but I did not think about it. Well, 21, because when I was, was 21. But, well, it's just more the Democrat. Neither party is perfect. Let me put that caveat. And both of them have areas that if I could, line out what to me is a perfect party, I would change. But the Democrat Party is more the party of the people. And much more, especially in the early 70s and 80s, supportive of women. Much more supportive of women. And that was patently obvious in the legislature. And Republican women never got anything in the way of leadership. They're just now beginning to get leadership positions. They never were given a position of power. And for instance, the year that Carlin was Speaker of the House, those 2 years before he ran for governor the first time, why, Ruth Wilkin was head of the tax committee, and he appointed women, and that's just the only example that comes to mind at the moment, but there were others. And so that was, actually, when we moved to Topeka, I registered as a Democrat.
When you first moved here?
Yeah, I'd made up my mind by then. I'd thought about it.
Now, when did you move to Topeka?
72.
72. So until then, you...
Yeah, I was a registered Republican in Mountain View, but an independent voter. Mm-hmm. And I'm still an independent voter, but I'm much more party-oriented than I used to be. You get party-oriented when you run because you have to be. You have to be. If you expect support from a party, you have to play the game to a point. You've got to go along when you're asked, especially once you're elected and so forth. And you have to attend party functions, and you have to get to know the precinct people, or at least make an attempt. I guess I don't really fit quite into a mold, because I was never party active at all until I ran for the legislature. I was issue active, at trying to affect change in areas that the League of Women Voters was interested in, or that the nurses were interested in, or that I helped out a little lobbying here and there with some of the child advocate groups, and always seems like I was lobbying for underdogs. I never had a job lobbying for any of the big boys.
Well, Dwayne was your first opponent And you say you didn't have a primary opponent in that election. What about the next election? Your second election?
The next election, I did have a primary. Michael Byington, who is a legally blind young man that runs, I'm sorry, I can't think of the name of the special service that he heads up, but it's for blind people. But Michael and I had a cordial relationship, Well, Dwayne and I did too. I must say, Dwayne Pomeroy was the gentleman of gentlemen. Neither one of us I didn't ever intend to throw stones. I didn't. Dwayne did not. We treated one another cordially when we saw one another. I'd always been quite an admirer and friend of Elwyn, his dad. And I felt real awkward around his folks during that campaign stuff. Just awkward as a dickens. Because there I was running against their son, and I always liked and admired Elwyn, everything. But that after I won, things eventually went back to the way they were. I still have a lot of feelings of admiration for Elaine Pomeroy and so forth. But that's I digress.
Well,
What did you ask me?
She asked you about the next
The opponents, yeah.
Oh, well, Michael ran against me, but it wasn't because of rancor.
Mm-hmm.
It's because he really wanted to put the needs of some handicapped folks in front of the people where they could be seen. And again, there weren't any stones thrown in that primary at all. And when I won, he endorsed me.
Mm-hmm.
So it was fine. And then my opponent was the former mayor. My Republican opponent was McCormick.
Hmm.
So why'd you win both elections?
Well, I believe that I won because I was the best campaigner. And also because I think I come across like basically I am, which is more or less open and honest, and willing to listen. And people, I read a lot of research. I'm just now trying to decide whether to throw all that stuff away that's upstairs. But when people vote, the ones who think beyond name recognition, which is not very many. Oh, excuse me a second. But we'll get back to where we were. I forgot.
We were talking a little bit about your elections and the district. What issues do you think were important to your district? If there were any.
We sent out a questionnaire, which was another way of getting your name in front of people and hopefully getting some to think back. And about the main issue that we got any kind of response on was the death penalty. There were more folks against it than for it. And so I decided to be against it. It's a very tough question.
Mm-hmm.
It's a very tough question. But so I was always, always against the death penalty. Issues, education is an important issue. The KNEA people endorsed both Dwayne and me in my first race. I understand that. I truly understand that. He had been a school board member, and he had been very supportive of teachers. Very supportive of teachers and very helpful to teachers. All they had on me was what I said I was going to do. And so they endorsed us both. And then the next time around, and I did support teachers in the legislature, they gave me the max, both in the primary and the general. Getting money when you're a non-incumbent is more tough than once you're incumbent, from the PACs. And so, what issues? Well, I know what I was talking about. I was talking about quality.
We talk about issues. It almost sounds like, in a funny way, issues wasn't the big deal then in getting elected. Or at least not.
I don't, my personal opinion is, Sarah, that I don't think issues did play a big part in my election at all. At all. Because, you see, most people don't vote like you two vote. Most people don't get beyond. They barely recognize the name. And then there are a few who will nail you on one issue or another, while you're at the door. But especially the first time when you run, it's the only chance you get. It's the only time you're clean. It's the only time that you have never voted. You're not on record for anything. And the fewer issues on which you go on record, the better. The better. Because we increasingly, every year, have these one-issue voters. That if you're for or against, say, the death penalty, or for or against abortion, which of course is almost never, there's not that much legislation about it, but there's lots and lots and lots and lots and lots and lots of emotions about it. And I don't want to get started on that, but I, of course, have been pro-choice always. But it just so happened that my opponent the first time was, and I don't know how McCormick felt about it. Didn't come up. Didn't come up. So I don't think issues were that big a deal. I really don't. I really don't think that issues had much at all to do with me getting elected the first time, and really not very much the second time. That's personal. You will find people that will blatantly disagree with that, or will feel that issues were important in their campaign, or that they defeated so-and-so on an issue. And that may be the case, but it just didn't happen to be the case with me. There's a lot of different ways to get elected. I feel like I got elected the cleanest way, just on the basis of making a huge effort to get out and see the people. And plus, they really say something to people if your parents, your spouse, your children, your colleagues knock on doors for you. That says something very positive without saying a thing. Without saying anything. If this person cares enough to knock on the doors for that person.
Yeah. Once you were elected the first time, and did you have a mentor or someone in the legislature that sort of helped you through things and maybe answered questions for you or anything like that?
Not really, but you see, I don't fit the classic because I've been a lobbyist for 7 years. I knew, quote, the ropes. I knew that legislation takes a long time to accomplish, that you don't accomplish anything overnight, that it takes time for it to percolate and gel and that kind of thing. And I've seen a lot of new legislators come to the legislature with their flags flying high and they're going to save the world. And I really did not have that illusion when I was elected that I was going to save the world. I knew better. But, I knew how to read a bill, and I knew the process, and I knew the leadership. I knew the people in the legislature, too. And so I really just did not fit the stereotype of a brand new to the Capitol legislator. Plus, I am so glad that from my perspective of having been a lobbyist. Because some, not all, but some legislators began to believe in time the press about themselves. They begin to buy into the fact that they really are something special and something wonderful, and somehow better, more intelligent, more powerful than the average Joe, but it isn't the person, it's the office. And you do get a lot of people suddenly behaving almost obsequiously to you. But since I'd been a lobbyist, it's just different. My perspective was just different, you know. I don't think that I hope that I never did see myself as that. Well, you know, there are just certain people who carry it around a little differently, and it's more common to senators than it is to representatives. But there are senators certainly who don't do that. But I was very thankful for that perspective. One, because I wasn't new, I wasn't green that way, and then two, I was just, you know, I've seen legislators who lost, didn't plan to, or who resigned for whatever reason, and it's like a curtain dropping at the end of a play. The attention, all that stuff is over, big, like that. And unless you know it, it can be really kind of devastating. I could name some legislators, I don't think I will on the tape, but who was a terrible shocker. Now, I'm not saying that I'm immune to everything, because, you know, after a session where everything builds, and you get more and more to do and less sleep and so forth to the end of a session, and it's just this crash course. When the session would be over, it would always be a letdown. It was always a letdown to me when I was a lobbyist. It was always a letdown to me as a legislator. It's a letdown to the staff. Mm-hmm. It's also, thank God, to the staff, you know, they've finally gone home. But everybody, I mean, not the legislators, the lobbyists, the library staff, the legislative research staff, the governor's staff, everyone goes on that ascending rate of involvement and busyness to the end of a session, and everybody feels a bit of a letdown, but also relief. Mm-hmm. Because no human could keep that pace, I don't think, for, you know, forever. And most people come to the legislature, they go home 10 to 20 to 30 pounds heavier than they came. Mm-hmm. It's true. Sarah, you're making a face. It's true. I had to go on diet every year when the legislature would be over, whether I was a lobbyist or what.
I just need to get your recipe for the diet.
It's called no alcohol, no fat, no sugar.
I was afraid it would be something like that.
No fat. What committees did you serve on while you were?
Well, my first time I was on energy and natural resources. And, oh boy. See, I was afraid you were going to ask me. I guess I have to go back.
We can check that out.
I was on a lot of different ones. Elections, which is considered a kind of a throwaway committee in a way. But then freshmen don't get the best committees. I was on one other. I'm sorry, my mind is blank right now. My second term, I was on public health and welfare.
That's what I was wondering.
I didn't, you know, I had some naiveties after telling you that I wasn't naive about anything. I didn't ask for public health and welfare because I assumed I would get public health and welfare as a nurse. And so I didn't get it. I didn't ask for it. So that was, see, I was a little naive about when you get into things there that, you know, I should have been very specific about getting it. And I wasn't, so I didn't get it. But so the next time I was on public health and welfare, and I was on a banking one, my second time, which I found interesting. And elections, a state on elections. Elections, votes in the elections committee are always party-line votes. Almost. And, of course, the parties wish to control laws around elections. Democrats always go for more liberal registration and so forth, and Republicans tend to want as much control as possible and the least, well, I don't want to use the word open, but the more people who are allowed to register, especially at the last minute, the more likely it is that those folks will vote Democrat.
Well, did you serve as, were you vice chairman or any leadership roles while you were in?
No. Never had a leadership role. 2 terms is not quite enough.
Yeah.
Usually. Except in a situation like when the Democrats took over the House, that one term that they did when John Carlin was Speaker, people who had no leadership suddenly were committee chairman because, the Democrats had a majority of like 1 or 2.
Yeah.
It was just bare majority, and so people were pulled into service that might or might not have been otherwise. But I'm sorry, your question again?
No, you answered it.
Did I? Okay.
Leadership role. What can you describe the power structure in the House at the time during your 2 terms in office?
Well, my first term, Wendell Lady was the Speaker.
Okay, he was you might name the names of the leaders that in the House too.
I'm going to have to go back to archives because I would be
Well, we can.
I could have written that down and stuff and gone and looked it up or thought about it or something. I have brain rot. And
It's reassuring to know what
Yes,
happened.
that's everybody.
that's a matter of record. Who was the leadership when I was in that? It seems to me that Rochelle Chronister had, he's from Overland Park and he has dark hair, and Joe Hoagland. When I was a lobbyist, a brand new lobbyist, Pete McGill was the Speaker.
Yeah.
Until the time that Carlin won, and then Carlin was the Speaker, and then of course he ran for Gov, and then Wendell Lady took it. I always liked Wendell Lady. I always worked well with Wendell Lady. He was a pretty liberal guy. He was fair, I always felt. And it is interesting. Some things did happen, though, because, when I was a lobbyist, nobody knew my party. And so I was treated equally well by both parties and by all legislators and so forth. But then once I showed my hand and people recognized that I was a Democrat, then you're never quite trusted by the other side. Which I found to be true when I tried some lobbying again after I was out. Once you've been a legislator, then you can't, not that I wished to, you cannot disavow your party. And I never disavowed my party, I just didn't ever reveal it. I mean, hardcore Democrats knew I was a Democrat.
Yeah.
But I didn't make noise about it when I was a lobbyist. And but I liked working with Wendell Lady, and Jo Hoagland was fine too. I'm trying to think whether Rochelle Chronister had, I think maybe she had a minor leadership role that first term that I was in, I believe. Of course now, she'll be Ways and Means Chairman.
Well, what bills did you introduce or legislation did you sponsor or co-sponsor?
It's a matter of record.
Yeah, we'll look it up.
It's a matter of record. I tended to be on stuff. I did not really. The only legislation that if people were researching me, they would tell you I was a do nothing legislator. You know, today's press type. Well, the media today, you know, if you haven't sponsored and won X amount of legislation, you know, they'd say, well, but I was, you know, tended to sponsor stuff for the women and the children and always anything to do with women's rights and or if a constituent asks you to sponsor something, then that's their right as a citizen, even if you don't agree with what it is they want. You know, it's their prerogative, and so there were a few bills like that.
Suppose we turn it around and we said to you, what did you accomplish by being in the legislature?
Not much.
How come? Is that the nature of the beast?
Well, partly because I'm basically not I don't know. I didn't have something that was burning me too badly, you know, that I really wanted to do. Some of the issues that I was most interested in, for instance, the women's movement issues, we fought. I was not a legislator at the time. You know, but we got the ERA ratified in Kansas, and we kept it from being de-ratified. And matter of fact, some of my toughest leaving here now is leaving my friends in the women's movement.
Is that, I mean, why did you not run for third term?
Because I ran for Secretary of State, and I couldn't hold my seat.
Okay. So it wasn't.
Well, that's right.
Decided.
Oh, I like campaigning a lot better than I like legislature, if you really want to know the truth. I'm really good at campaigning. You know, if I wanted to, I could set myself up as a campaign advisor and help people. Because I know how to do that well. A lot of politics is, I don't know, I got awfully, see, I told you, and it's the truth, that I'm an issue-oriented person more than a party-oriented person. And I got a bellyful real soon of the parties warring against each other, and both of them trying to make the other one look bad, and seeming to me accomplishing almost nothing.
And that goes along with what you just said, too, how you feel about what you did.
Yeah, this is my perspective, and I'll be very interested to know if people are candid. If anybody else has the same feelings that I do, but I see no reason to be other than candid with you. But by the time I'd done 4 terms, I didn't really give 2 hoots whether I ran again or not, or a little. But as I decided, they didn't have a candidate for Secretary of State, and I thought, I'll give that a shot. And I did, gave it my best shot. But and we got 46% of the vote in Secretary of State race, which there's only been one Democrat ever that was Secretary of State in Kansas, and that person had the same name as the current Secretary of State. I don't know if you've researched that, but they had a Secretary of State who was senile. You can do what you want with this, but it's the truth. And that person's daughter was really running the office. That Secretary of State was no longer capable hardly of signing his name and would get lost on the State House grounds and pee on the trees and stuff. and was, an embarrassment to the party. But a party can never vote out its own. Mm-hmm. So I don't know how this person of the very same exact spelling decided to run, but the Republicans crossed over and voted for the Democrat. He ran. He had one term, and then they put up a new candidate, which was Shanahan.
Oh, yeah.
And then he was elected and held it till he died, and then his wife held it until she bowed out and let Jack Breyer. They named Jack Breyer so that he could be an incumbent, when he ran the first time. I don't know, and you're not talking legislature, so why?
That's
don't you
okay.
just
No,
tell me to be quiet?
that's
Oh, no.
interesting.
Oh, no.
But,
In the legislature, did you participate in any coalitions or groups?
yeah,
Did
sure.
you?
We had a women's group that met.
Was it like the women's group this year that kind of formed, or was it
Well, I don't know what the women's group was like this year because I wasn't down there.
okay?
So I can't speak to
How
what
many
that was.
women participated in the group?
Mostly the Democrat women,
Just
and
Democrat.
a couple of Elaine Hassler always came.
Mm-hmm.
You'll like interviewing her. She's a real good head. I'm very fond of her.
Mm-hmm.
She supported me when I ran for secretary. Because she's kind of like I am. She's a little more issue oriented and a little less caught up in the party stuff.
Were most of the women that way? Is that why maybe women for a while didn't get much accomplished? Or is that not so?
Well, it's your perception that women didn't get much
I've
accomplished.
heard some women tell me they got less accomplished than they would have if they played the game more, I guess is what I'm coming from.
Oh. I played the game when I felt I had to. You have to play a game with your party. You have to play along, or, you will never get anything. And that's true with both parties.
Mm-hmm.
That's true with both parties. Although the most recent speaker has been powerless. He's never been able to marshal his troops. And he's had all those mavericks, and it was very frustrating. And it was even frustrating, even my last 2 years in the legislature, he wasn't as powerful as he might have been, but then that totally fell apart after that. In the year that I tried to lobby, heck, you had to lobby him, but then you had to lobby a whole bunch of other people too, because he couldn't marshal his troops. But a good speaker can get the votes when they need them, and a good minority leader can get the votes when he or she needs them. And I changed how I would vote a couple of times for Carlin as my governor, only because I was asked, and not because it was how I felt about the issue. But there's that kind of higher, little bit of loyalty that you're expected to have, and I guess it was there because I did it. And I was real pro-labor, pro-education, which are considered Democrat issues, but those were not conflicting to me to do that. I'm sorry, I got off subject.
That's okay.
What are we supposed to be talking
We're
about?
talking about the women in the legislature.
Well,
How many were in the legislature while you were there? In the House, for instance. Okay,
Well, there were more in my second term than there were the first term, and we were not quite. We were about, I think, maybe 18% women in my first term. I don't remember the exact number, but our legislative class, interestingly enough, the class of 82, or we elected in 82, we started in 83, had more women elected that year, and also our education level was higher than the average legislature. There were more women than the average in the legislature, and our education level was higher.
Hmm.
And the women tend to have a higher education level that are elected to the legislature. Well, there are a lot of people who run, like, say, farmers who retire, or their son is working the land and they're working less hard, that may not have had a college education. Sam Roper, from Girard, he has a high school diploma. He was in my class of '82. So then, but there are even some people in the legislature have been who don't have a GED.
Hmm.
But they represent their districts,
Mm-hmm.
and they represent them pretty well.
Mm-hmm.
So,
Did the women that you're talking about vote together on any issues? Can you recall any?
yeah, we did sometimes.
Mhm.
Sometimes on usually child-oriented issues, health issues. I think most of the women supported the seatbelt
Mm-hmm.
laws and for kids, kiddies. Shoot, what do you call them?
Child
Infant seats, yeah, car seats.
Car seats, and stuff like that.
Well, were there issues that all the members of the legislature felt like were women's issues, and where the men kind of looked to the women to make a statement or decision on them?
Well, maybe, but women's issues aren't seen as important by most men, and usually women's issues tend to need funding, and not to have sources that are sources for funding that come in without. And so the women's issues tend to be poverty issues. Not always, but when you're talking about age-dependent children, and you're talking about battered women, and you're talking just a lot of, the divorced women have a much lower income, the single families, than other households, and so those issues tend to need state money. And when I was in the legislature, at least, we were only just beginning to get any kind of power to lobby the powers that be within the legislature to appropriate more money. But you can never get, there's only X amount of money.
Mm-hmm.
And traditionally it's appropriated in other areas and not so much for those programs, and it isn't better, it's worse right now.
Mm-hmm.
If you look at the mess SRS is in now, that's one thing I kind of have followed. It's being cut back, and social workers and so forth are being let go, and that we don't have the money to fund our social and rehabilitative services like we need to in the state. We don't have it. And so I always saw Joan Wagnon as one of the best potential leaders. Well, I know. I like I said about Joan, I have the highest respect for her, and if anyone ever deserves a leadership position, it's Joan, and I think she has the qualities to become Speaker of the House. But of course, for that to happen, the Democrats have to get a majority, and it would be interesting because, of course, right now, I guess Marvin Burgess is running for re-election, as far as I know. He's the minority leader, and she would have to defeat him. And I do not even know if it's her ambition. haven't talked with Joan about her ambitions for 4 years because I've been out of the legislature, and I'm one of those people that thinks when you're out, you should stay out, and I have.
I would be interested to know your kind of sense of what are the most likely career paths for women. And of course, we're talking about the legislature, but where would you expect to see women make gains? Would it be in the leadership roles? Would it be in leading big blocks within the legislature, getting out and getting into running for national Congress? Where do you expect to see women make gains if we're going to make gains? Or don't you think we're going to?
Well, I think, just generally speaking, women have made a lot of gains. I mean, I have more friends now who are professionals in the true sense of the word. That is, meaning they are in line for promotion in big firms and are not given token titles. But where is it? Well, you know, in the legislature, everything boils down to money. Everything boils down to a pot of money and how it's distributed.
Mm-hmm.
And traditionally, with the good old boy system, the men have managed that pot of money. And they've been, well, the Ways and Means Committee and the big lobbyists. It used to be for what we call big oil, but of course oil has taken a hit in recent years and doesn't have the money that it had. But lobbies like the phone companies and the utilities and the medical society and groups that command big amounts of money and therefore can contribute large amounts of money to campaigns and tend to, labor has strong influence on the way things go. As teachers do. I mean, it's not all white collar or whatever you call it. But I'm getting off the subject because you asked me where I see women. Well, the woman that bought this house is 30. She's single. She's tall and beautiful and just darling, and she's come here with Hill's Pet Food Products, and she writes computer programs. I don't know what her salary is, but my sense of this young woman is that she is in a rather sharp angle ascendancy. She's neat. She would be a neat addition to Topeka. I don't know how long she'll stay.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't believe you would have seen a woman like that 30 years ago or 35 years ago when I graduated from college. There were just so many fewer. More women are physicians now. I mean, the way things change, I believe, is for women to have the jobs that are seen as important. And for men to help do some of the jobs that were seen as less important. For instance, our son does a lot of the caregiving. And our daughter-in-law works full-time. And John works part-time, but he's an actor, and it's harder for him to get full-time work as an actor, and he's always, taking part-time jobs and stuff. But I believe as those roles change, and they are changing, most of my young friends, the men do more of the caregiving, not all, but most of it, and I don't really see things changing in the legislature any faster than they change in society. People make a mistake, I think, of going to the legislature to try and change what they see as an ill. And they will try desperately to change something in the legislature, but the fact is that things don't change in the legislature until the people want it. I really do think that legislators and legislation tends very much to reflect public opinion of a few years behind maybe, but the legislature doesn't do something that people don't want done. because they'll come out of the walls. And so society doesn't change so quickly. But if you look back 30 years, which is pretty easy for me because I graduated nurses training in '58, I see positive changes. Sometimes it's hard to look back 2 or 3 years and see positive changes. And the leadership will change. Other legislators, other states have women governors. You know, Kansas is the most interesting state because we are so progressive in so many ways. We are much more progressive than many states with our laws, with women's ability to own things in their own right. You know, Kansas does not consider women chattel, as they are still considered in some states. You know, our inheritance laws are up to date. They're very current. Back in the early '70s, when we were working on so strongly on women's issues and the ERA and so forth, at that time, we went through all our statutes and de-sexed the language. In the '70s. We were one of the very first states to ratify the ERA. We have progressive laws when it comes to family law and children's rights, but we still have a lot of the old Bible Belt, very conservative. Well, liquor by the drink is an example how long it took us to come into the 20th century on that. But also, you know, women are seen as an helpmeet by Republican males especially. I said it. But, you know, those attitudes just don't turn over overnight. They don't turn over overnight. And on the campaign trail, not as running for the legislature, but as Secretary of State, I was treated very cordially and very nicely, but man, it's a whole different ballgame. I'll talk about this one not on record because it's not what you're researching.
Well, Judy, we'd like to ask you a few kind of questions about your private life and your.
Okay.
You can answer however many you want or what you don't want to answer.
Sure.
How old were you when you were in the Kansas House when you were elected the first time?
Well, I was born in '35, so I was in my middle 40s.
Okay.
I think I was 46, I believe. 82. I was born in '35. How old would I be?
46, 47, something like that.
Yeah. Well, you're
Quite young.
You're not a native Kansan. You said you moved to Kansas.
I was born and reared in Lawrence.
Oh, you were. You are a native then.
My
Okay.
dad lives in Lawrence.
Okay.
Still.
What was his occupation?
He is not retired. He's 84 and he's not retired. He sells life insurance for Northwestern Mutual.
Oh my goodness. Could you describe your childhood and growing up experiences in Lawrence and elsewhere?
Well, I don't know whether it was on record because I don't know if I was talking about this on record. I was talking about growing up. My dad was, he's always sold life insurance. And he was always a very active Lawrence citizen. He took his turn as chairman of most of the kind of major things that cities have. I mean, in those days they called it community chest. He was never drafted because he just would have a birthday. You know, every time they would up it during World War II, he would have another birthday. And he never was drafted and chose rather than volunteer to do things like work on draft boards, ration boards, and those were tough jobs. Being on a ration board, there was no quicker way to. Well, people would try to pay him off and get him to give them more sugar or for their bakery or more whatever, you know, gas for their. But he never would. And those were tough years. But those are the kinds of things he did in those years. And then he was drafted to run for the school board, and he refused to campaign. He said, if you want, and he didn't. This was right after the war. And he was elected. And served 3 4-year terms. And he he helped integrate the schools in Lawrence. They were segregated at the time, and I mean those school boards. It wasn't just Daddy. It was the boards were very progressive at the time and accomplished a lot in Lawrence.
When did he do this with the integration?
Well, they just had a black school over in North Topeka in North Lawrence. I mean while Daddy was on the school board, they integrated the schools in Lawrence, and this would have been probably in the 50s. Or late 40s. I don't know exactly.
Was it before Brown versus the Board of Education? It's all right. It would be interesting.
That's a matter of history, and I could ask Daddy, but I don't honestly know where it was exactly. But I kind of think it was before. But when was Brown Board?
54.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, I know it was, because I graduated from high school in 53, and my dad was president of the school board, and he gave me my high school diploma.
Mm-hmm.
Got to hand it to me. You know, he was passing them out as president of the school board. But I believe that it was before that.
Mm.
I believe it was before that.
Well, now, did you have brothers and sisters?
I have one brother. He is 3 years younger. His name is John Cotton, and he lives in Redwood City, California, and he's a banker.
Hmm.
Was your mother a role model for you?
My mother was a traditional housewife. She had 2 years of junior college in Arkansas City, Kansas, where she came from. And then she was a career girl. She worked, she sold clothes.
Hmm.
And while Daddy had finished junior college in Ark City, and he came to KU then and spent 2 years. He worked a year between because he had to put himself through school. And then he graduated in 29. Of course, and the stock market crashed and everything. And they were married shortly after he graduated, maybe a year after he graduated, and they were dirt poor like everybody. He was trying to make a living selling life insurance, and the only thing she ever did, I think, to earn any money was, be on the election boards, and you got probably $2 for the day in those days. I don't know what you got. They still pay people a little. When you go to vote, there's so many Democrats and so many Republicans that are there. But, no, she stayed home. She cared for the family and cooked and was very bright. Played bridge several times a week and was always one of the best bridge players in Lawrence. She read. She made a big sacrifice, I think. But she also did what everybody else did then. And it was a little hard for her, for me to step out of that role a little bit. That was well, we all like to have our own choices replicated because it makes us feel that the choices we made were good ones. And I did stay home. I worked for a while when we were first married until we had 2 babies. Then I stayed home for 8 years, and then we were out. By then we were out at Stanford. Jack was doing a residency, and I went back and took a refresher course and nursed at Stanford. Then I kind of got active in politics out there too. Eventually, decided I was going to do politics when I got to Kansas. I intended to hit Kansas running, and kind of did in a way. I immediately ran for president of a now defunct organization called Winter Women. It was Winter Wives at the time. It was the wives of the people who were at either Menninger or Topeka State or whatever. So I got that presidency bingo when I got here, and then got active in the League of Women Voters, and in just a few years I was president of that. Because I had ambition to run for the legislature, but I also knew that I needed to establish a name for myself and make some contributions to the community, or felt like that my chances would be a lot better, if I had, and I wanted to. Anyway, I didn't do any of that stuff because it sounds calculated. In a way, it was planned, but I enjoy being a part of the community. always belonged to the Chamber of Commerce just because. And Jack, my husband, I kind of always see us as a team. He's a very fine physician. And he works very, very hard at his job, and he does it extremely well, but he's very focused on his job. And besides being a fine physician in the community, he has not been a person who played a role. He wasn't in civic clubs, or he didn't be chairman of the Boy Scouts or anything. He never did anything like that. And I just felt like we were a team that way, that I did that. Mm-hmm. And that together we made a well-rounded contribution to the community, whereas just one or the other wouldn't have been perhaps as well-rounded. But so I kind of played the role that my dad did, but I also played, I'm a real good cook, and I mothered, did plenty of mothering, and one thing the lobby job allowed me to in the early 70s was I could still come home, get dinner, be here. But I was gone enough that our youngest child figured out, she wasn't totally happy about something. She'd call my mother, and then Mother would call me. Well, Laura was alone for an hour and a half, so or whatever. So I had my share of mothering guilt, that I had to deal with, but it was a little tough. But my mom, if she had lived, she would have supported me. Mm-hmm. She was supportive. I mean, I wasn't into it more than several months before she died, but she was supportive. But she came along. When I was first a kid, they were real strict with me, and there were good girls and there were bad girls, and there weren't any gray areas, and about the same with anybody. But they've grown as they grew, as society grew, and eventually they had a pregnant girl live with them, and they kept her, and Mother went and held her hand while she delivered. But when I was growing up, that would have been tough for them because nice girls didn't get pregnant.
How old were your children when you were in the legislature?
Oh, by 82, they were pretty well grown. Mm-hmm. One of our kids graduated from high school in 77, one in 78, and one in 81. So I didn't have anybody even in high school by the time I ran. And so I had essentially paid my dues, or done what my mother thought I should that way. I got out of school before I ran, and the last one in college. When Laura, at least, Amos was in school, we had an AFS student here. And I've since had, just last fall, we had 2 boys from Guatemala live with us for a semester. Jack and I have always been interested in lots of different countries and lots of different cultures. And
do you think being in the legislature had any effect on your family, or yourself, or your parents, or?
Well, there is a certain amount of prestige that goes along with the job because, as I said earlier, because it's the job. Because you have been duly elected, and it's impressive, to get the thing with the seal of the state of Kansas and to look there at the Capitol, and I wasn't immune to having a few chills down my back, to be proud of being elected, because I was, but there's just so much Mickey Mouse in politics that eventually didn't take me too long to decide that 4 years was enough. But sorry, you asked me what?
Well, do you think, what do you plan to do when you go to California? You were a nurse before.
I just
you
got my nursing
lobbied.
license back.
You got your nursing.
I'm gonna nurse.
So it really hasn't changed your occupational.
Well, for 18
Goals
years I
and-
didn't do it. I did things for which I was not trained.
So how come you're not going into politics in California or helping somebody else run a campaign in California?
Well, I wouldn't want to say to you that I won't help somebody else because I might. And also, if there's something, Lord knows what, that I feel strongly enough that needs changed, I don't know what I might do because I certainly know how to go about making noise about something if I want to.
Mm-hmm.
But really, I think my interest is more in issues. I don't see myself running for office. I really don't.
Mm-hmm.
I really feel, just from my personal perspective of having lobbied for the number of years I lobbied, and then been in the executive branch and been in the legislative branch, that I can accomplish as much, if not more, probably more, from personal contact, calling it matter of record.
Okay.
Um,
I guess you probably answered most of the questions that we were going to ask you about yourself, in sort of
in the
other
context
questions.
of
Yeah.
other questions.
Is there anything else, our last question, is there anything else you'd like to tell us that we haven't asked you about that you think was important, enlightening, just something you would like to share?
I don't know, it's, we get talking about one question or another question and something comes to mind, but how effective are women legislators? Some of them were quite effective. The trouble with being effective is in the eye of the beholder.
Mm-hmm.
And there are lots of ways of being effective. One of them is to give good constituent service to members of your district, to maintain contact with those people, to write them newsletters, which most of us women legislators did and very few of the men do. When Ruth Wilkin was the representative, which she was for 10 years of this district here in Potwin, 56, she wrote a newsletter that then was reprinted, and a lot of folks sent out, but Ruth wrote it. And a lot of Democrats sent it out, but Ruth wrote it. And then, when I became a legislator and she was a lobbyist, she continued to write it, the newsletter for the Democrats, and people could subscribe to it for a very minimal amount. So the first term that I was a legislator, Ruth continued to write that newsletter. Then she decided she didn't want to do that anymore. And most of us would take what she wrote, edit it, and put out our own. Every district is a little different. So some issues are hot in some districts and not in others.
That's right.
And my district is, District 56 is kind of an interesting mix, but it's by and large middle class and upper middle. I don't know. It's been a long time since I've studied that, and I'm not sure, but it has West Hills and some really kind of nice homes and Prospect Hills. And then it has lots and lots of just little bungalow type homes that have 2 or 3 bedrooms, and they keep their lawn mowed and geraniums on the front porch, and a lot of state workers. Many people employed by the state in this district. Of course, the state's a big employer all over town. This district isn't unique in having a lot of state workers, but the Kansas Association of Public Employees was always very supportive of me. Always very supportive of me. Just happened to get to know one of their lobbyists real well, and I always liked him. His name was Darrell Plummer, And well, that's neither here nor there. So what? I mean, they just were, and I enjoyed working with them. I worked with the people who were lobbying for the women's issues would be around my office. I mean, they knew that if they needed some help, that they could count on me. One thing I did decide to do when in the legislature was to take positions on things. Some of them that I already knew my position, like on women's issues, but also like on the death penalty, like I told you, I decided to be against it. I can see arguments on both sides sometimes, but I feel it's meted out unfairly, more blacks and so. But I was darned if I was not going to have a position on an issue. Because if you don't have a position on an issue, the lobbyists drive you crazy. People who are undecided, they're in and out of your office, and they're wanting to take you here and take you there and buy you stuff as they see you as a swing vote. And I wasn't, and there are some legislators who know how they're going to vote, but who play the game because they want the free meals. And there's everything in the Kansas legislature because there's everything in humankind. And that's all it reflects.
Mm-hmm.
And most of them are just real special people, but there's always some that are moochers, or there's some that are alcoholics, there's some that are avaricious.
Mm-hmm.
It all exists because it exists in human nature, but by and large, they're a swell group of people. It was a great club to be in. I made friends in the legislature and friends in the lobby corps that are friends no matter what. As a matter of fact, the people I've been saying goodbye to the past few days have been either were in the legislature or were or are lobbyists, or because you do make some fast friends, and I feel that way about some of my legislative colleagues, certainly.
That'd be
I am interested in what it takes in terms of personal life for a woman
Yes, we didn't quite get into
No, we
that,
didn't.
to decide to run for, to succeed in running for, to stay in. What does it do to? It sounds like you were in an awfully fortunate position in terms of money and in terms of I'm not calling you rich, but you're not living off a $20,000 salary or something.
I did not have to work in order to add another job, and that is an important factor for anybody that's in the legislature. There are people who would like to run who simply cannot afford to do so. That's why it tends to have retirees. They can finally afford to do it. I've seen attorneys that ran for the legislature stay 2 years and go home because many times their firms are saying either you come home or you're not with this firm anymore. There are other law firms that are more supportive and will actually, quote, sacrifice the income of one of their members to have someone in the legislature, and they recognize it's important. So that varies, but it's hard for people to hold down a full-time job now. We have some teachers that manage to get a leave of absence that spring semester. But you ask me, well, I think Jack felt a bit martyred because I really, he didn't really see much of me during the legislative session. He had more than his share of cold meals or canned tuna fish during those times, but he was a pretty good sport about it. He was a pretty good sport. And the kids, they were pretty well gone. I think they were mostly proud to have me in it, but you really would have to talk to them about some of their personal feelings about it. don't know. Kansas, of course, is our legislators. Kansas prides itself that our legislators have other jobs and that they go home to them 8 months a year. And we aren't a professional legislature, and we feel that our legislature is better for that. That people go back to their farming, their law office. In somebody like Joan Wagner's case, she runs a YWCA and be's a legislator and manages to do them both well. But some of us didn't have that intense of jobs other parts of the year. There are a lot of people that go to law school while they're in the legislature. And manage that. Marge Petty, state senator, went to law school. She's an example. Joan Adam from Atchison. Lots. Males, females, both. Go to law school.
Would it have been possible for you to have your legislative job grow much larger? I mean, if you'd kept on and you'd been leadership, would that have been okay, or would that, you think, have been a real...
I'm not sure whether I would have gone for leadership just with my particular personality makeup. I was chairman of our delegation. I took my turn as chairman of the delegation, which I enjoyed very much. And you hold about 3 meetings a year, one in the summer before the interim studies start up, and one before the legislative session, to hear what people, you invite the city commissioners and the county commissioners and any group that you can think of that might want to present some need. And see, there's another way the legislature divides up, which is interesting. I mean, it's not only Republican, Democrat; it's also rural, urban, which you're very aware. But then the delegations line up. The Sedgwick County delegation and the Johnson County delegation is extremely powerful. The Johnson County delegation. Shawnee County delegation, we would stand together most of the time on most issues. Because, well, you gotta support your city. You want to support your city. And so that's another way. And then male, female, there was some of that. Not too much, but some. So
you found being a legislator a doable job. It wasn't economically or personal time this terribly destructive thing, but
it's a consuming thing. For those, especially the last 6 weeks of the session, you work hard and play hard too, in a sense, because the work doesn't stop. The interest in a certain issue doesn't stop because it's 5 o'clock in the afternoon. So if everybody, and there's always something for you, there's always some lobby group that's having a cocktail session. Talk continues. Legislators, of course, that go out every night and get tanked up, and others
we must have different bodies
that do once in a while. I could. There's certain folks you can't match, not unless you want to be an alcoholic too. But I remember Dixie Burkett, who worked for years in Fred Weaver's office. Recently, they've been doing these fitness tests. They come down and do fitness tests on legislators. Well, one of the questions is how much you drink. And I remember Dixie saying, "Does this mean during the session or the rest of the year?" But there's, I think there's maybe less of that than there used to be. I really think that when I first came in the early 70s, there were a lot more drunks than there are now.
It sounds like it was a great job for a while and you don't have too many regrets about leaving.
I don't have any regrets about leaving it. I feel like I've done it.
Mm-hmm.
I feel like I've done it, and I had the experience. It was interesting. I didn't really accomplish as much as I would like to have accomplished. But that's just kind of how it is. But in any case, I learned a lot. And when I'm 55, and I don't know. I think by the time you get to be my age, you're a little more interested in giving a service that's somewhat meaningful rather than that looks good on a resume. At least that, I think I may work with AIDS patients, for instance, when I get to California or something like that. I don't have to have my name in the paper. I don't care.
I think that was the ideal that Kansas was looking for all along in this legislature.
Well, maybe, I don't know, but it just, it was felt so good to be back up there. I had to do 200 hours up at St. Francis, and it really felt like I'd come home because that's what I trained for. And I just hadn't used it the past 18 years. So I'm kind of excited about being back. Nursing has made progress.
Mm-hmm.
It was very hard for me to see progress in nursing when I was involved in it, but coming back, nursing has made real positive progress.
Well, that's interesting. Yeah.
And that's exciting to me.
Mm-hmm.
So I think, I see myself more just, I don't know what I'll do yet. First I'm going to get out of in order. First I'm going to steam off yucky, old, bad taste paper and put up decent, and paint shelves and get organized, because I can't go to work till I'm organized. And then once we're going to live in a condo with just 2 bedrooms, we're shrinking way down.
Ooh.
You are.
And but I think that's appropriate for our age. Jack will be 55 in August, and that's why we're going through. So I'm deciding, do I still have to have Tono Bungay in my library, or can I give it to friends of the library or whatever? I can hardly remember it. I just picked that one out of the hat. Or Lady Chatterley's Lover and whatever the hell all else is up there. We've already got about 6 or 8 boxes. The idea is that somebody else should read it. I think you said that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So why is it sitting there? Somebody else should read it.
Well, I think maybe we want to